Why Media Group? The fastest growing media group in North America.
Hello and welcome back to Y Media Newsroom. I'm Ramona Singh, and the latest news on the state of the Cusma trade pact, which is between Canada, United States, and Mexico. Well, we just had our trade minister to US come back, and we had our prime minister say that there needs to be more work done. So Canada is ramping up their effort to secure a new trade deal, not a new one, but to be able to go through the renegotiations and confirm it's still good because we're at the 6-year mark with the United States and Mexico ahead of the July 1st deadline. That is the July 1st Cusma review deadline. And to that, well, the trade minister, Dominic LeBlanc, says that the recent discussions in Washington, D.C. were positive and constructive. But Ottawa has formally proposed extending the CUSMA for another 16 years, while also seeking relief from sector-specific tariffs on steel, aluminum, and auto sector. So what does this mean? Well, on July 1st in 2020, CUSMA agreement was signed. In that, there's a clause that in 6 years there will be a review. So that 6-year mark is this year on July 1st. And if it's not agreed on, the items, then it will trigger an annual review. If the agreement is agreed on, as is, with maybe some minor changes, but not so huge to really open up the agreement completely, then, if that's agreed on, then it will get renewed for 16 years, keeping it in place. Now, that's an issue because our counterparts in Washington, D.C., the Trump administration want to make some major changes when it comes to CUSMA, specifically in the auto sector. So this review is very critical time, very sensitive for Canada with the economy slowing. We saw the GDP contract for 2 consecutive quarters, Q4 of 2025 and Q1 of 2026. And then you have the trade uncertainty that weighs on business investments for businesses that need to know where to put their dollars in, to have some, projections on growth and stability. Well, it makes it very hard when Canada's biggest customer, 70% of Canadian exports go to the United States. So United States is Canada's biggest customer. And if Canada does not know how it's going to hold on to its biggest customer, then we're going to have some serious problems. So now here are the key facts is that Canada has proposed extending CUSMA until 2042, which is the 16-year term from now. The agreement faces mandatory review on July 1st, so that's just weeks away. That's the countdown. July 1st is also Canada Day, so we're watching that very closely. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc recently took a trip, right? Before his trip to the United States, there was no discussion with Canada and the United States. Essentially, we heard that United States and Mexico were on their second talks, and there was some talks about that United States may want to do a separate agreement with Mexico and a separate agreement with Canada, which would not be what CUSMA is, because CUSMA is all three countries together. And so there was a lot of alarm that Canada had yet to speak to the Americans in terms of the Trump administration. So prior to Minister LeBlanc going to the United States for this official talk, he sent an official letter to say Canada has every intention to, renew this for another 16 years, keep it as is. So the trade minister went to the United States, met with Representative Jameson Greer in Washington, and it was described as a positive conversation. Canada has appointed veteran public servant Janice Charest as the chief negotiator for the review process. And even she said, like they're going to be taking a look at this and they're going to be doing their best. But this is really important because nearly 90% of Canadian exports, when it comes to Canadian oil, 90% goes to the United States, 70 to 75% of Canadian exports go to the United States. And right now, under CUSMA, you have 90% of Canadian exports currently entering the US tariff-free under CUSMA. So if this is not done accordingly in the next few weeks, then if there's tariffs on any of those 90% of the exports, then we're looking at a massive change in what it means for the cost of doing business, what it means for that business and those sectors in those industries, and their bottom line. So it's very significant because let's just say there's a 20-25% tariff that essentially could wipe out profit margins based on what the product is that is being exported to the United States. And if that's the case, then we're looking at job losses. We're looking at shrinkage of what a business is able to do. So the United States wants to have tougher automotive content requirements and stricter rules for origin to increase American manufacturing. This is a massive change in Cusma that would have to be negotiated in the next few weeks and come to terms. Now, the Trump administration has signaled it intends to maintain tariffs on some Canadian imports, even when negotiation continues. So, is that legal? That's something that Canada will have to, challenge. So overall, if you want to know the big picture, right, 70% of exports go to the United States. We're looking at a 16-year extension on July 1st of this Cusma agreement. The deadline is on July 1st of this year. Nearly 90% of Canadian exports are tariff-free that go to the United States. We're looking at about $3.5 billion cross the border every day. That's the US-Canada border every single day. We're talking about $1 trillion agreement here, right? That's what Cusma's worth. The US-Mexico trade deficit in 2025 was 196.9 billion, but the Canadian dollar forecast gain it showed progress about 3.7% over 12 months. So you have this entire thing of where President Trump said that, there's a trade deficit, that Canada's not buying as much as the United States is buying, but that the trade deficit's there because they take 90% of our oil going from Alberta from the pipelines down to the United States, and they buy it for below market rate. So, why does this matter? This is very significant because according to Bank of Canada, the outcome of the Cusma review could significantly affect the Canadian economy. There's no doubt about it, right? If you own a business and you have a customer that buys 70% of your products, or you have a business that provides services and there's a customer that takes, brings up, 70% of your revenues. One customer, we're not talking about multiple, we're talking about one customer. And if that one customer decides that it doesn't want to buy from you anymore, it just doesn't want, it's just not interested. What does that mean for your business? Are you going to be able to survive on the 30% of exports, or in this case, 30% of revenues that come in from other customers? And for Canada, that means, 30% of exports from, other countries, right? Whether it's China, European Union, and whatever the case is, and India to come on market soon. That's the case. 30% isn't enough to run your economy. And if we're looking at our GDP shrinking, contracting, by 0.1% in the last, and or 1% in the last two consecutive quarters, then what will it mean if we lose, 70%? Okay, let's not say we won't lose 70% of our trading partner, but what if that drops to a significant amount because there's going to be tariffs? And what does that mean for Canadian businesses? So it's a very critical time on how this minister is going to do his job, given that he had his first round of conversations officially just weeks before the deadline of this review, right? So if talks fail or result in stricter trade barriers and exports, investments, that will impact hiring, and the GDP growth will all weaken. That is a sure thing. This isn't even speculation, it's a reality. So the Bank of Canada warns that an unfavorable outcome could reduce Canadian competitiveness, lower export volumes, and put the economy on a weaker growth path. And higher tariffs could also raise prices for consumers, and that means that it's going to slow the economic activity significantly. So, what are the major flashpoints that our minister has to work on with his American counterparts? It's the automotive sector. The United States wants stricter North American content requirements for vehicles and parts. Canada's auto industry is concerned because these changes could disrupt existing supply chains, right? You have parts crossing the border multiple times before you have a finished product. And so that's going to be very significant. There's also the steel and aluminum. You have current tariffs that remain as a major irritant, with Canada pushing for their removal on the tariff list as a part of a broader agreement. One thing that President Trump has had an issue with is Canada's supply chain management, right? And that is on dairy and supply management. The Americans are saying that they continue to have, they want greater access to Canadian dairy market, and that's one of the most politically sensitive issues in Canadian trade policy. And they're also saying, hey, they want to be more competitive because essentially the supply management keeps the price of dairy, eggs at a certain mark for Canadian farmers. And to that, well, the Americans are saying that it makes things not as competitive and it also doesn't give them access into our markets. So that's really critical because Canada, needs to get back to the table and to have multiple, negotiations take place, which I believe is going to be of high concern for the Prime Minister in these next few weeks because, this could shape the entire trajectory of Canada. Because if we go into a situation where we go into an annual review, then businesses will leave Canada because it's just not a place you can invest when you don't have the predictability of knowing what's going to be tariffed, what's not going to be tariffed. Businesses say that trade uncertainty has become a larger problem than tariffs themselves, right? What causes trade business uncertainty? Not knowing what the price of your goods are going to be when they're exported. Now, the Trump administration has recently proposed an additional 10% tariff on Canada and several other countries, and this is targeted. It was anywhere from 10 to 12.5%. And this is targeted for any industries where with forced labor. To that, the prime minister said, it was expected because the president told them, but they're also looking into to make sure that industries that we have good work standards, that we're not importing goods that have forced labor as a part of it. And this is kind of an indirect way to say, hey, is if Canada's going to have a trade agreement with China, and what we've heard in, the longest time when it comes to Chinese exports and what could be forced labor. And this is something that America's saying that they're going to put a tariff. In other words, they're saying if you're going to import, goods from countries that may have certain practices, then there's going to be a 10% tariff. So it doesn't, easily come through the back door through Canada across the border into the American market is another way of putting it. You have the Business Council of Canada CEO Goldie Hyder saying that companies are delaying investments in Canada because of the uncertainty surrounding the trade rules. So these next few weeks are very critical. And to that, you have the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses. They're arguing that Canada should avoid signing a poor agreement simply to meet a deadline. Now, do you agree with that? If Canada doesn't meet its deadline, then it's going to go for an annual review. That's part of the agreement in Cusma. It was signed in 2020, July 1st. There's a 6-year mark for a review, which is now in 2026, July 1st. If it's not met with the Americans and agreed on what is in Cusma, and not renewed for another 16 years, then it will go for an annual review, and that is going to be something that, even though if Canada can get a better deal, there's going to be lots of unpredictability if it's an annual review. And so here we have it. This is a situation that is right now a very significant concern as we watch how we're reacting and what this means by the federal government. Now, trade uncertainty could affect more than exports. What we're looking at is when businesses don't know what tariffs will apply, they don't know if it'll affect their industry, they don't know if it's going to affect the pricing that they put to go to market, right? Because you have your wholesale costs and then you have your margins that are added on it to be able to have that export. So if you have a tariff on it, that could just change your entire business model, even if it's at 10%, and the worst case scenario, what we've seen at 25 to 50%. Also, not knowing what trade rules will look like will significantly impact a business model and what to do in that. And that affects jobs, right? It affects predictability. And that also affects what the supply chains are, if they're going to be stable or not. So this will create delays when it comes to, production, when it comes to investments of staff, when it comes to factory expansion, hiring, equipment purchases, investment decisions. All of this will have an impact if you don't know what the cost of doing business is to your number one customer, which is the United States, as it takes 70% of our exports. So this is a situation where Canada is weighing, and I think the public needs to kind of be part of this conversation, which is, do you do a quick deal, on this review, which I think the Americans hope, because they can push some of these items on supply management, on dairy, and when it comes to the automotive industry, and push more for made in America. The pros would be you restore business confidence immediately, you encourage the investment, because then Americans and Canadians know that this is a 16-year agreement and you can just continue as is. If President Trump does anything that's outside of the agreement, at least you have a way to challenge it if he puts on tariffs on things that should not be tariff that's in the agreement. It will reduce uncertainty immediately. It'll support economic growth, of course, but the cons of there are that Canada may have to make concessions on dairy, on auto, and other sectors, right? And Trump could still change course later, but at least Canada will have an agreement that they can challenge if the president decides that he's going to go otherwise in the agreement. So that is a situation where you could have a rushed agreement where you actually say, okay, US will take some of the deals that you want to do, but we want to have the consistency and the confidence in business for the next 16 years. Or you wait and negotiate, and the pros there are more time could secure better terms. But that also means, and I'll get to the cons before I do, let me just finish the pros. Political pressure on Trump may increase because of that, because he feels like Canada's backed against the wall. And if Canada's back is against the wall, then maybe Canada will agree to the auto, changes on the percentages that should be more American made, and that will definitely impact the automotive industry in Ontario, right? So you have that aspect of it. But then if Canada decides to wait, then maybe there might be pressure on Trump and what is deemed, from his administration as well as the American population. And Canada then avoids unnecessary concessions on auto, on dairy, on some of the other things. But the cons there are then, there's going to be massive uncertainty. It will trigger the clause for an annual review. And that is something that we definitely don't want to be in a situation where, where businesses don't know from year to year. You see how fast a year goes. And if you don't know what it means for this year to next year, how can you actually invest in your business if you rely on, your business to have an export into the United States? So that's very significant. We're against the clock. We're going to take a quick break and we're going to be right back.